My next big marker is probably one of the biggest things you can do to have a dramatic impact on your health. And unless you ask your doctor to run, they're probably not going to do it unless they've been trained in functional medicine. But I find this is such a quality marker to see the inflammation that's going on in the body. These are so critical of setting up a foundation of wellness. And not just wait till you're sick and break down. Welcome to the Trusted Pharmacist, where you'll learn the truth about how the body works. Do you ever wonder what the blood work that your doctor is running really means? And what I see a lot of times is many patients bring me blood work to go over and understand what this is telling them about their health. But actually, most of the blood work that patients are bringing to me is blood work to really find illness, not to find and keep them healthy. And sadly, even most doctors, even on most of the blood work they're running, they understand the lab values and normals. And how common is it that they run blood work on you and they're saying, hey, everything looks normal. But I can tell you, when we get normals on lab values, all that really means is they took a big set of people, they tested them over time, and what they found is that the ones that were quote unquote normal fell within a certain blood range. But what we're learning more and more about science and some of the blood markers that we can do is that normal may not be normal and definitely is not optimal. So we're going to talk about that today and understanding not only the typical blood work your doctor runs, but more importantly, about 5 or 6 tests that I think are predictive for future health events. How can you be proactive to make sure that you stay healthy and don't have the problems down the road? Now, when you go to your doctor, they're typically going to run what's called a CBC. And to be honest with you, this looks at things like electrolytes and certain things that, be honest with you, unless you're super sick or really having problems, they're not really going to tell us much. And the other thing they're going to run is a complete cardiometabolic panel, which that's not bad. I mean, if you look at the cardiometabolic, there is something about a fasting insulin, and we'll talk about that in a second in terms of actually a fasting blood sugar that can be beneficial. But more importantly, they look at liver enzymes and some of your immune function, which yes, are important, but I'm going to say they're more a sign of current disease. And I'm saying, let's be more proactive and let's find out what we can do to prevent disease. And those are the things that we should look at. So in addition with that, sometimes I'll run a cholesterol panel. And I'll be honest with you, we're going to get into one of my episodes on cholesterol because a cholesterol panel run is honestly trying to figure out if you have cracks in your driveway from like 10,000 feet above. It really doesn't go into the detail that we need to understand what your cholesterol is doing. And then the last thing that they'll sometimes look at and they'll run is a hemoglobin A1C, which is a good predictive test, but I think there are better tests to look at your metabolic aspects of things. And we're going to dive into that. So once again, if you don't go for regular blood work just because it's a hassle, do me a favor, do so. And you need to be doing that. It needs to be part of an annual checkup. But more importantly, part of that annual checkup, I would say include those blood markers. But more importantly, here's the 5 or 6 tests that I think are going to give you a better benefit in terms of bang for your buck in terms of preventing disease. So the first blood marker I want to look at is something called a fasting blood glucose. Now keep in mind, this is part of a traditional complete metabolic panel. The doctor's going to look at your blood glucose. But the important thing about this is we want to do this fasting, because if we don't do this fasting, it really doesn't tell us a whole lot about really metabolically where we're at. So what happens is if you eat carbohydrates, your body's going to produce blood sugar, and then that goes up and down throughout the day. But if you've slept all night long and you've been fasting, you haven't ate anything in a while, and you check your blood sugar, most of these labs that you're going to check look to keep your fasting blood sugar underneath 100. And above 100, that typically is when doctors start looking at things like diabetes. But at numbers way below 100, actually in the 90s, we start to see the beginning of something called insulin resistance. That means that the body's making insulin, but it just doesn't work the way that it should be. And to be honest with you, a fasting blood sugar that's ideal is 85 or less for those that are under 60 years of age. If you're over 60 years of age, ideally a fasting blood sugar should stay between the lower limits of the 70s up to about 90. Keep in mind, and I see this all the time, it's this fasting blood sugar that creeps up over time, which indicates that this insulin resistance is starting to happen, then pre-diabetes is starting to happen. And I'm going to be honest with you, if you don't do something in the meantime to help keep that under control, you're ultimately going to end up being a diabetic with blood sugars, because you don't become a diabetic overnight. You become a diabetic over time. And if we're not monitoring and watching this, and sadly, most doctors and healthcare providers, they're just like, oh yeah, everything looks normal. It's wherever it should be. But if you look at your trend of your blood work and you see your fasting blood sugar each time you check goes from 87 to 92 to 94 to 96 to 98, you're trending and you're going to end up getting there one day to be diabetic. But even probably more important over time to look at is something called fasting insulin. So when your body makes blood sugar and it's floating around in the blood, then the body has to get that out of the blood into your tissues to work. And the body uses insulin to do that. And a fasting insulin can be a big indication of really metabolically how healthy your system is, even more so than your blood sugar. Now, granted, the fasting a blood sugar on your labs is one thing, but the insulin levels in your labs is dramatically different. And it has a really big range. But I'm going to tell you, if you do this test fasting, which means you haven't ate in like the last 8 to 10 hours, that fasting blood insulin level should actually be probably between 2 and 5. Keep in mind, the lab says it can go much higher than that, but the ideal is between 2 and 5. And to be honest with you, if you can keep it between 2 and 3 fasting, it indicates that your body is using the insulin properly. Because if you run a fasting insulin and you see it's 5, 8, 10, or 12, granted, your blood sugars may be normal, but what it means is your body's having to make more insulin than what it needs. And when our body makes more insulin than what it needs, it begins to do things like storing a lot of these blood sugars as fat. When we store fat, it creates inflammation. It drives a whole host of blood complications in terms of overall health problems. So once again, your blood sugar and your blood insulin are very important markers. And a lot of times the doctor's going to run your blood glucose. So you probably don't have to ask that, but you're probably going to need to ask for that fasting insulin or a blood insulin level to get that number on your lab work. The next critical marker that should be run all the time, but crazily, even with all the data out there, a lot of healthcare providers don't check, and that's your vitamin D status. And this is not really, we don't actually check the vitamin D, we check a metabolite, which is 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D. It's the standard measure of what your vitamin D status is. And the crazy thing about vitamin D, and we talk about it all the time, is it's a pro-hormone. It does so many things in the body, about 300 different things. But one of the things about vitamin D, when your levels are low, it affects your mood, it affects your immune system. For women, it has an effect on your hormones, how well your body makes its bones. And what I want to stress is with vitamin D, when we look at the labs say that the normal range is between 30 to 50. And many times people bring me in blood work, and it is way below that 30 to 50. But I'm going to tell you, most of the data now says you need to be at least 55 to 60, and we can actually go up to 80 for optimal status. The thing with vitamin D is that if you don't check it, you don't really know. I get asked a lot of times, how much vitamin D do I need to take? But vitamin D is so critical in so many processes, and it's such a simple marker to check. It's a cheap marker to check, but why we don't do it more, don't quite know. More doctors are catching on, and I do see it more often. So keep in mind, the important thing is on your vitamin D status, if you're not basically checking or you're taking a vitamin D supplement, you really need to be checking this vitamin D. And it takes about 3 months from when you start taking vitamin D, it's a fat-soluble vitamin, to really get to a steady level. So whenever you start a vitamin D supplement or you increase your dose on a vitamin D supplement or decrease it, you need to really have your vitamin D level checked about 3 months later and monitor from there and make adjustments. But once again, that ideal is between 60 to 80. And if your doctor says 30 is normal, I don't really trust that as much as what I would really think that needs to happen in terms of the vitamin D levels that are appropriate. My next big marker is probably one of the biggest things you can do to have a dramatic impact on your health. And the way that I see it is what's called HSCRP, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. That's a super strong test of that marker. They can also run what's called a CRP, which is not as sensitive, but the HSCRP is a little more sensitive to looking at this marker in the blood. This is an inflammatory marker that's actually produced in your liver. And when your liver starts making this, it indicates something is not quite right. Talk about it all the time. Inflammation drives disease. And if you can keep your inflammation low, you're going to have a healthy gut, a healthy heart, a healthy brain, and your body's going to function and basically run all the processes from metabolism, energy, and all that so much better. High inflammation, you're going to run into disease problems down the road. So what I suggest on the HSCRP is we really want to keep this in this less than 1 range. If your HSCRP is between like 1 to 3, that indicates some things are going on. If your HSCRP is 3 or higher, we really need to start looking really deep into what is causing inflammation. Keep in mind basic things like diet and stress, poor gut health, environmental toxins can all drive this HSCRP. So it's extremely important to be looking at this. And I can tell you this is one, unless you ask your doctor to run, They're probably not going to do it unless they've been trained in functional medicine. But I find this is such a quality marker to see the inflammation that's going on in the body so that we know it doesn't really tell us where it's at. We've got to go looking for it, but it tells us you've got inflammation going on. And if you don't take care of this soon, it can drive things like heart disease and other things that are going to give you a problem down the road. If your doctor is saying they're checking your thyroid and when you get your blood work back, the only thing you see is something called a TSH, you're missing the boat on this because a TSH isn't even a marker of your thyroid. TSH, which is called thyroid stimulating hormone, is actually a substance that's produced by the pituitary brain that tells the body, hey, I need more thyroid, or hey, I don't need any more thyroid. And what's crazy about TSH is it really isn't even a marker of your thyroid hormone. Now, it is something good to work with, and many doctors, and including myself as a pharmacist, this is what we were trained to check in terms of our thyroid function, but we've got to dig deeper. One thing about TSH is, I'll tell you, it has a very wide range of what's considered normal. And actually, over the years, this range of normal has actually dropped from 6 to 8, from 6 down to 4, and that's kind of where it's at now. But the optimal amount of your TSH that you really want to be produced is 1.5 to 2. I can tell you if your TSH is a little funny because when your TSH is high, it means your thyroid is low. And when your TSH is low, that means your thyroid is high. That means you're getting too much thyroid. So it's a little inversely proportional to what you might think. But ideally, the TSH, we want it between 1.5 to 2. What's important is for your doctor to check other thyroid markers, and more importantly, the thyroid hormone. The two main thyroid hormones your body produces is something called T4, which is the storage form of thyroid, and T3, which is the active form of thyroid. And your body produces about 80% of this T4 over here. And honestly, T4 is not very active. It doesn't do much in the body. Now, the body has to convert this T4 to T3 to be active, and that's what basically gets your metabolism going and all the benefits you get from thyroid. And a lot of things affect that. So as we talked about is if you don't monitor your T4 and T3, you really can miss the boat about what's going on. So those should always be checked. And even more importantly, they may check something called a free T4 and a free T3. This is actually the amount of hormone that's free to get from your blood out to your organs where it does its work. Because one of the things is many of our hormones, whether it be our sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, or even things like thyroid, are bound to certain things called thyroid holding hormones. And there's this thyroid hormone, it floats around on little boats in the blood. And when it floats around, it can't get out of the blood to do the work in the tissue. So what's important is to monitor the free amount, which is probably the most indicative about what is called bioavailable thyroid hormone to have its effect on the bodies. This is something I would recommend on your thyroid to be checked every year. If you're on thyroid medications now, it's super important that you have your thyroid hormones checked anytime you start a new medication or anytime there's a change, probably anywhere between 8 to 12 weeks after making a change. And what's even more important is we need to check our thyroid hormone about the same time every day so that it's adequate, we get the right blood amounts. So if you take your thyroid hormone in the morning or whatever time, and ideally it's best to take in the morning, you want to actually have your blood work done about 4 hours later because it's the best indication of your true T4 and T3 levels based upon the thyroid medication you're taking. If you take your T4 in the morning and then later in the day, 8 hours, 12 hours later, you check your blood work, it's not going to be very accurate in terms of the T3, especially because your body clears that T3 super fast. So if we're going to make these changes in our thyroid, we want to check it about every 8 to 12 weeks. And then we ideally want to take and do our thyroid level checks about 4 hours after we've taken our thyroid. The other things we might want to look at is if we continue to have multiple thyroid issues, at some point we might want to check something called a reverse T3. If you keep running into low thyroid symptoms and your blood work looks quote unquote normal, you might check something called reverse T3. Reverse T3 is the opposite of T3, and it actually challenges and works opposite of your traditional T3. If you think of T3 as the gas, reverse T3 is the brake, and they fight for the same thyroid receptor. And sometimes certain conditions can cause a reverse T3 to be high, which can work against your thyroid function. So it's something to keep in mind. The other thing is if you run a lot of low thyroid symptoms and your doctors have never checked this, you need to check something called thyroid antibodies. These are antibodies to the thyroid gland, to the thyroid hormone receptors, And what happens is we have an autoimmune reaction, which means the body's own immune system begins to think that the thyroid is foreign and it attacks it. I can't tell you the number of people who have low thyroid. And to be honest with you, most people who have low thyroid, it's not the most common reason is something called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It's an autoimmune condition. But if your doctor never checks your thyroid glands, especially for the thyroid antibodies, you will never know you have this. So it's super important that you're having your doctor run this full thyroid panel. You don't need to run thyroid antibodies all the time, but they need to be run, especially if you're having low thyroid symptoms. Another great way to see if you have a lot of inflammation in the body is do something called an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And what is that? So omega-6s are a certain type of essential fat that is found in nature that can be typically inflammatory, especially in high amounts. These are found in things like seed oils, found in the meats of animals that are farmed in a more modern day terms in terms of eating lots of grains. They don't get any exercise. It's like feedlot cows. It's like farm raised fish. They're not wild caught. And the protein that's in these animals is high in omega-6s because that's what they're eating. They have a lot of inflammation because they're not moving around. And then these seed oils, basically that are fats that are what's called omega-6s, are very inflammatory. Versus omega-3s, which is an essential fatty acid that our body needs. The main two things are EPA and DHA, and these are found in things like wild-caught salmon. You can have sardines, mackerels, anchovies, which are things that most people don't eat. And unfortunately, in the standard American diet, the way most people eat, this omega-6 to 3 ratio runs anywhere from like 15 to 20 to 1 or even higher. I've seen some patients in the 30s, which means their omega-6, the inflammatory oil, is off the chart, and the omega-3, which is the anti-inflammatory oil, is very low. Believe it or not, ideally for the best way to set yourself up for low inflammation, and decrease your risk of cardiovascular disease, really protect your brain in terms of long-term cognitive issues, making sure we prevent things like Alzheimer's and things like that. We need an omega-6 to 3 ratio of like 2 to 4 to 1. So keep in mind, I told you the standard person is like 20 to 1. We need 3 to 4 to 1, which means we need to lower our omega-6s. We need to raise our omega-3s. And I can tell you, this is one marker that is huge in terms of preventing long-term disease by reducing inflammation. Once again, you'll have to ask your doctor to run this one. This is not one that's standardly run, but it can be so valuable in terms of helping make sure you stay healthy for the long term, because unfortunately our diets are just loaded full of these omega-6s, and it's such a balancing act. And if you don't check this, you'll never know it. And one of the last markers I think is key for overall health and wellness is something called homocysteine. This is an amino acid that's found in the blood that at certain levels can indicate we've got problems in terms of our detox pathways and our metabolism. But more importantly, high homocysteine levels drive cardiovascular disease, horrible for brain health. Your body sometimes can't make its neurotransmitters. And when our homocysteine levels are in a certain range, it shows that all that's working properly. But when it's out of range, it can really indicate some problems. So here's the thing is, it's typically a process, or homocysteine is great to look at our methylation. Methylation is a detox pathway, the way our body breaks down certain things. And if we're over-methylating or if we're under-methylating, we typically see a homocysteine high. Once again, don't trust the ranges on the blood work. We want a range kind of between 5 and 8. We don't want it to go above 8 because that indicates methylation is poor. That indicates we're driving heart disease, a lot of inflammation. Our detox isn't working good. It could also indicate we're low in our B vitamins. Our B vitamins, especially the methylated activated B vitamins, are so super critical to make sure methylation is working properly. Now, keep in mind, we want to do methylated B vitamins, especially if we see that our homocysteine is above that 8 marker. But the one thing I do want to stress is we don't want to over-methylate, because there's some really good information out saying that if we over-methylate over time, we actually can increase our risk of cancers. So once again, it's like with everything we do, it's all about balance. But this homocysteine is a great marker to look for how our body's methylating, look for some inflammation, especially important in terms of brain health and heart health. But once again, we want to keep it in that nice tight range of about 5 to 8. So if you're outside of that range with the homocysteine, you're going to want to make some changes. But once again, this is one you're going to have to ask the doctor about because they don't look at. But if you look at all of these different blood tests that we've talked about, these are so critical of setting up a foundation of wellness. and looking at your health in terms of being preventative to make sure that you're the best you can be over the long term, and not just wait till you're sick and break down. Do these to monitor over time to make sure you're doing the right things. And if you see they're out of ranges, that's where you can talk to your doctor about it. You can check out us at Magnolia Pharmacy, but we can help you find the things that can make a difference. So the next time you're in for your annual physical, you need to talk to your doctor about running these blood work. If you've got traditional insurance, your doctor can typically code these and get these where you can get these paid for, so you're not having to spend a lot of extra out-of-pocket costs. Now, there are certain groups nowadays that are starting some functional medicine tests that you have the ability to go on and run this vast array of tests. One of the ones I know Dr. Hyman has a group now called Function Health that he's promoting, and he's went to one of the big lab groups and got these at a tremendous discount. You might check into that. But most of your doctors, if you're going for regular blood work, can add these as part of your regular blood work panel. And the key thing is with many of these blood markers, there are supplement choices that you can make that can have a big difference. Like the omega-6 to 3 ratio, a high-quality ultra-pure omega-3 can be huge. It can also help in terms of your HSCRP in terms of lowering that. Omega-3 is also big for helping your blood sugars under control. But once again, your diet is important. Your exercise is important in terms of keeping that fasting insulin and that fasting blood sugar in those nice ranges that we talked about. But you can also look for supplements like berberine and chromium that can also help in those issues. The other thing to look at is in terms of your vitamin D. I always recommend to take a vitamin D3 plus K product to raise your vitamin D levels. But keep in mind, the neat thing about vitamin D is you need to be checking those levels because everybody has a little different set point they need. I've noticed a lot of people with gut health issues, and even though you take a vitamin D, and I get people to 6, 8, 10,000 units a day, and they still don't have adequate levels to be able to get them where they need at. So you want to look at things like your vitamin Ds, your omega-3s, talking about the homocysteine. That's something, a good multivitamin with a good amount of methylated B vitamins, B12, B6, and folate. And I hate to say, most of your cheaper vitamins have the unmethylated forms, or they have just folic acid, which is really kind of useless. You need to get a methylated folate. But these are all things that can make a difference. But the thing that I want to stress is if you're not going for regular blood work and you're not being proactive to your health, you're going to break down over time. And it's so much easier to be proactive and prevent your body from getting sick and then taking care of yourself now versus finally breaking down and go to the doctor. So make sure you're doing this blood work on a regular basis to make sure you stay healthy. And I hope you've enjoyed what we talked about today. But more importantly, if you've enjoyed this, I think it's super important as we start our podcast to make sure to like it, share with your friends and family. Because like you said, I want my friends and family to be as healthy and as happy as possible. And this is the type of stuff that does that. And the other thing is make sure you subscribe to our channel. Like I said, The Trusted Pharmacist. I'm not going anywhere. I really enjoy doing this. I really enjoy the functional medicine side of things, of helping patients be successful to take back their health and do the things that can make a difference. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoy what you've learned today. Like you said, please share it. We hope to see you back next time for another edition of The Trusted Pharmacist.